the most horrifying event that occurred while Lieutenant Nick and his soldiers needed to travel to the other district to recruit conscripts. However, along the way, a heavy rainstorm occurred, forcing them to take shelter in a village. It was this village that became the starting point of all the Eerie events. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. To fully understand the story, we need to go back to around February 2016. During that time, the military in the southern region conducted conscription by sending soldiers to various villages or districts to set up conscription units. All the conscripted soldiers would be stationed in the 3 southern border provinces. When establishing a conscription unit in any district within these 3 border provinces, the military would first send a patrol unit to survey the area to assess the level of risk. The information gathered would then be used to plan and deploy the appropriate military unit to set up the conscription station. At that time, Lieutenant Nick received orders from his commander to lead a team of soldiers to survey an area on a mountain that extended down to Raman District. This area was predominantly forested with few residential homes. Lieutenant Nick was tasked with reaching Raman District urgently because it was a high-risk area due to terrorist activities. To complete the mission, Lieutenant Nick decided to lead his team to survey the area that very evening. As they set out, heavy rain began to pour, reducing visibility for driving. The roadsides were surrounded by dense forest, and the combination of the cold air and strong winds forced the soldiers in the back of the truck to move into the cab of the 4-door pickup truck for shelter. During this time, they pulled over to the roadside to allow the soldiers to move into the cab and take shelter from the rain. Suddenly, a local villager and a child riding a sidecar motorcycle passed by. The villager stopped and greeted Lieutenant Nick's group, asking what the soldiers were doing. Lieutenant Nick explained that they were there to prepare for setting up a conscription unit. The villager then suggested, "If you want to take shelter from the rain, you can go into this alley. There's a village there." Lieutenant Nick turned to his soldiers and asked if they wanted to wait out the rain before continuing, mentioning that it wouldn't matter if it got a bit dark since their vehicle had spotlights. Moreover, they were in a large group, so there shouldn't be any problems. After agreeing, the driver led them into the alley. About 700 meters in, they encountered a fork in the road. Both left and right turns led to rough, dirt roads, making it impossible to tell which tire tracks were recent and which were old. Based on what the villager said, the village should be close by after entering the alley. However, when they reached the fork in the road, they were unsure which way to turn. The driver suggested continuing straight since the villager hadn't mentioned turning. Lieutenant Nick decided to follow this suggestion and drive straight ahead. As they continued, the rain intensified without any sign of letting up. After driving for a while, they noticed villages on either side of the road. On the left, they saw a village with cows kept in pens. Lieutenant Nick worried that if they took shelter in the left village, the cows might get startled, potentially causing problems for the villagers. Thus, he decided to have the driver steer the vehicle to the right, where they saw a mosque and parked there to take shelter from the rain. All the soldiers quickly got out of the vehicle and took shelter under the small overhang of the mosque's roof, which extended outward slightly. In their hurry, they forgot that wearing shoes in that area was prohibited. At that moment, someone who was praying came out and reprimanded Lieutenant Nick's group, saying, "Hey, how can you enter here with your shoes on? Don't you know it's dirty? According to mosque rules, shoes are not allowed inside." Lieutenant Nick immediately apologized and offered to have his soldiers clean the dirted area. However, the villager curtly responded that it wasn't necessary and seemed visibly displeased. Lieutenant Nick didn't pay much attention to the villager's attitude, and they continued to wait in the area. Eventually, around 6 p.m., the rain stopped, and it was just beginning to get dark. They then walked back to the vehicle. As they were about to leave, an elderly man from inside the mosque followed them and asked where they were headed next. Lieutenant Nick explained that they were going to Raman district to prepare for setting up a conscription unit there. The old man suggested an alternative route. He explained that if they drove out of the village and turned left at the first intersection, they could follow that road straight ahead. Though the road wasn't in great condition, it was definitely shorter than their original route. Lieutenant Nick asked for confirmation. So, turn left and go straight all the way, right? The old man confirmed, saying, yes, just go straight. Don't turn anywhere else. After contemplating the advice for a moment, Lieutenant Nick decided to follow the old man's suggested route. He was worried about not reaching their destination in time and setting up the camp. If everything wasn't ready by the time their superior came to inspect in the morning, it could cause problems. They followed the old man's directions, turning left at the intersection and driving straight for about an hour. Despite this, they saw no sign of a way out to a populated area. Instead, they were surrounded by dense forest on both sides. Although the road was a dirt path, they weren't driving slowly at all, maintaining a speed of about 80 to 100 kilometers per hour. After driving approximately 10 kilometers, Lieutenant Nick used the radio to ask the base for further instructions, explaining that they had not yet reached Raman district. The base replied that they would consult with the commander. Nevertheless, Lieutenant Nick instructed the driver to continue following the road. By around 7 p.m., there was still no sign of an exit. Moreover, the road started featuring alternating curves and straight stretches, with each curve turning in the same direction, giving the impression that they were driving in circles. By around 8 p.m., Lieutenant Nick ordered the vehicle to stop and called all the soldiers to discuss what to do next. They debated whether they should turn back, which would take about an hour, but seemed preferable to continuing on an uncertain path that might end nowhere. Additionally, if there were terrorists ahead, it would be difficult for them to escape. The consensus was to turn back. Surprisingly, the return journey seemed to take less time than the initial drive. By a little after 9 p.m., they had reached the intersection where they had originally turned in. Lieutenant Nick instructed the driver to turn right towards the village where they had taken shelter from the rain earlier. However, when they arrived at the village, they found that none of the houses were lit. Everything was completely dark, unlike earlier when they saw cow pens and bird cages hanging around. When the vehicle's headlights illuminated the village, it seemed as if no one lived there at all. After parking in the village, Lieutenant Nick got out of the vehicle. He checked his communication devices and saw a flashing red light indicating weak signal coverage, but it was still sufficient to communicate with the base. Sensing trouble, Lieutenant Nick radioed the base to request assistance in guiding his team out of the area. However, the communication was intermittent and garbled, making it difficult to understand. Additionally, their mobile phone signals were extremely weak. Lieutenant Nick assumed the base would eventually pick up their signal, so he ordered all soldiers to stay put in the village for the time being. While waiting, Lieutenant Nick led some soldiers to explore the surrounding area. The village was eerily quiet, as if truly uninhabited, which was strange since they had seen people at the mosque and had spoken to them just that evening. As they explored further into the village, Lieutenant Nick noticed a flickering light from a TV in one house. He remarked, "Look, there really are people here." One of the soldiers added, "The TV sound isn't in the local language. Maybe there are people talking inside the house." Lieutenant Nick led his troops closer to the house from which the sound originated. The house resembled a single-story townhouse with red brick walls, some of which were cracked and decayed. There were 4 steps leading up to the front of the house. Lieutenant Nick decided to go up and take a look. He greeted and asked permission from the homeowner in the Yawi language. A voice from inside the house responded, "What is it?" Lieutenant Nick politely asked, "May I ask for directions? My team and I are lost." However, after he finished speaking, there was no reply at all. At that moment, Lieutenant Nick thought that the people inside the house probably didn't want to help. They slowly retreated and walked towards the next house to continue their search. Eventually, they encountered a group of about 5 to 6 children playing together. Lieutenant Nick approached the children and asked, "Which house do you live in?" The children raised their hands and pointed to a house without uttering a single word to Lieutenant Nick. The house they pointed to was a large one next to a mosque. Lieutenant Nick then led everyone towards the house the children had indicated. As they walked, one of the soldiers commented to Lieutenant Nick, "Sir, I think something feels off." However, Lieutenant Nick reassured the soldier not to worry, saying they should quickly check the house and then leave. On their way, they came across an elderly couple. Lieutenant Nick greeted them in the Yawi language and explained that they were lost, asking the man for directions. The elderly man instructed Lieutenant Nick and his team to drive straight ahead and then turn left. Upon hearing this, Lieutenant Nick immediately responded that they had just come from the left turn and that it led them back. However, the old man insisted, repeatedly telling them to turn left and leave quickly. After this unproductive conversation, Lieutenant Nick and the remaining soldiers walked back to their vehicle. He informed the driver, who had been waiting by the car, that they had questioned the locals but hadn't obtained any useful information. The driver then suggested that if the old man recommended the left turn, which was the direction they had gotten lost, perhaps they should just drive straight ahead instead. The decision was unanimous, and all the soldiers got back into the car. The driver drove straight ahead, and as time passed, it reached around 10 p.m. Lieutenant Nick ordered the spotlight to be turned on for better visibility. Despite driving for about 20 minutes, they still hadn't reached the main road. They clearly remembered that when they initially turned off the main road, it took less than 20 minutes to reach the village. Lieutenant Nick then instructed the driver to turn back. When they returned to the intersection, he told the driver to turn left and drive straight. Shortly after, they finally reached the main road. Once they were back on the main road and had driven approximately 20 kilometers, the driver suddenly pulled over to the side and pointed to the left. The sight stunned everyone. It was the same alley they had just exited to reach the main road moments ago. As Lieutenant Nick and his soldiers were bewildered by what they saw, a local on a motorcycle happened to drive by. The driver signaled the motorcycle to stop and asked the local how to get to either Raman District or Thungyongdang District. The local asked if they were lost, to which Lieutenant Nick replied, "Yes, we are. Started raining and it got dark. A local suggested we take shelter in the village, but now we can't find our way out." Despite this explanation, Lieutenant Nick felt uneasy and distrustful, fearing they might be misled again. The local advised them to drive straight ahead without turning. "Just go straight and you'll reach Thungyongdang." Lieutenant Nick then asked if they would pass through Ramen District. The local confirmed this, and so the team continued driving straight. Eventually, they came to a bridge over a mangrove river. After crossing the bridge, they encountered a cluster of 4 or 5 villages, which reassured Lieutenant Nick that they were on the right path. Finally, they saw a sign indicating that Ramen District was just 3 kilometers away. They drove on until they entered the area of Thungyangdang District. At around 11:30 p.m., after parking the vehicle at the district office, Lieutenant Nick got out of the car and saw no one around except for a volunteer on duty. He approached the volunteer and said, "We drove from Arangay and passed through the Rua village. It started raining, so we turned left into a village to take shelter." Before Lieutenant Nick could ask more, the volunteer, looking shocked, exclaimed, "How did you get in there? Who took you to that village?" "I'm from Ramen, and that village has been abandoned for 40 years. How did you find your way out? Did someone give you directions?" Lieutenant Nick decided to recount the entire incident to the volunteer, explaining that someone from the mosque had told them to turn left out of the village and then drive straight. The volunteer then revealed, "Do you know that if you kept driving straight, you would have reached a cliff? The path the old man told you about is a dead end that ends at a cliff. It used to be a route for locals to reach their rubber plantations, but it's not a regular road anymore." Upon hearing this, Lieutenant Nick still didn't think of anything supernatural, assuming instead that they were being misled or pranked. The driver then remarked, "So, they were trying to lead us to our deaths?" At that moment, Lieutenant Nick informed the unit to send additional personnel for a thorough area check. The unit dispatched 4 more men, and upon their arrival, Lieutenant Nick and his team drove back to the village, leaving 5 soldiers at the district office. By the time they reached the entrance to the village, it was around 1:30 a.m. They turned on the spotlights to illuminate the path, only to find that the road ahead was drastically different from what it had been a few hours earlier. The road had turned into a dirt path overgrown with grass, making it nearly impassable. Lieutenant Nick told everyone that they must have taken a wrong turn, insisting that this couldn't be the right path. However, the driver was adamant that it was the correct route, as it matched the coordinates on their radio. Ultimately, they decided to return to the district office to regroup. The next morning, they recounted the story to the locals. Upon hearing Lieutenant Nick's tale, the locals unanimously agreed that it was an abandoned village. After completing the conscription selection process, Lieutenant Nick discussed with his subordinates that they would have to pass the village entrance again, as it was the only route back to the district. As each unit began to leave, only 2 squads remained, as Lieutenant Nick's team needed to ensure the area was clear before departure. After packing up, they drove back along the same route. They arrived at the mysterious village entrance around 4 p.m. Lieutenant Nick asked the soldiers if this was the road they got lost on the previous night. The soldiers confirmed it was the same. Lieutenant Nick then contacted his superior to report finding a village not marked on their GPS coordinates. The superior was surprised that an unchecked village existed in the district and ordered Lieutenant Nick's unit to gather information on all eligible conscripts in the village to submit to the district for conscription calls. Consequently, Lieutenant Nick's team did not return that day and had to continue their duty in the mysterious village. At around 5 p.m., Lieutenant Nick's team set up tents and tables and posted signs indicating they were recruiting for the 2016 military conscription. 6 soldiers took turns on guard duty. Once everything was in order, Lieutenant Nick sat down with his soldiers to discuss the strange events. They wondered why the village had seemed deserted the previous night, but was now bustling with activity. By around 9 p.m., Lieutenant Nick went to sleep in the tent. When the time reached about 1 a.m., he woke up because he heard what sounded like soldiers talking loudly. When he got up and unzipped the tent to look outside, he saw that the soldiers were all asleep. He started to wonder whose voices he had heard. Additionally, at that moment, Lieutenant Nick felt an unusual chill that gave him goosebumps. Deciding to investigate, Lieutenant Nick woke the sleeping soldiers and asked if they had been talking. They all denied it. The driver, who had followed Lieutenant Nick, admitted he had also heard the voices for a while. Surveying the village, Lieutenant Nick noticed it seemed normal but eerily dark, with no lights on anywhere. He walked to the vehicle and activated the siren, creating a bright, flashing light and a loud noise that echoed through the area. Surprisingly, no villagers came out to investigate the commotion. The situation prompted Lieutenant Nick to assemble all the soldiers. It was then that one soldier reported that a team member, named Jack, was missing. This alarming news added to the growing sense of unease and mystery surrounding the village. The assembled soldiers informed Lieutenant Nick that Jack had gone to the vehicle around 11 p.m. but hadn't returned. Thinking Jack might have fallen asleep in the vehicle, Lieutenant Nick went to check, but Jack wasn't there. Some soldiers started searching for Jack and eventually found him asleep in front of the mosque. When Lieutenant Nick woke him and asked why he was there, Jack explained that he had initially fallen asleep in the car but had no idea how he ended up at the mosque. Lieutenant Nick speculated that Jack might have been intoxicated, which could explain why he ended up there and couldn't remember. He sternly reminded all the soldiers not to fall asleep on duty and instructed those not on watch to rest. Afterward, Lieutenant Nick and the driver decided to explore the village, curious about the unusual silence and inactivity. They hoped to understand why the village seemed so eerie and lifeless. Both of them had been exploring the village for a while when they came across a group of about 4 men sitting in a circle, drinking tea. Lieutenant Nick greeted the group in Yaoi, and the men asked, "What are you doing out so late? Why aren't you inside sleeping? Don't you know that people don't go out walking around here at night? You could end up dead." Hearing this, Lieutenant Nick acknowledged their warning, and they walked away. On their way back, they saw a woman sitting in front of a house. They wondered why they hadn't seen her there when they passed by earlier. Lieutenant Nick and the driver decided to approach the house, but as they got closer to the door, the woman spoke in Yaoi and pointed inside the house. Lieutenant Nick couldn't catch what she said. Then the woman turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. As soon as the door of the house opened, a corpse that had been hanged suddenly dropped down right in front of them, causing Lieutenant Nick and the driver to jump back in shock. At the same moment, the woman who had been sitting in front of the house vanished without a trace. Once they regained their composure, Lieutenant Nick pulled out his flashlight and signaled for all the soldiers to gather at the location. During this time, the driver approached Lieutenant Nick, nudging him and saying that the woman who had been sitting in front of the house looked remarkably similar to the hanged corpse inside. After all the soldiers gathered, Lieutenant Nick ordered some of them to guard the corpse. Then, he and 3 other soldiers went to find the group of men who had been drinking tea earlier. However, when they arrived at the spot, there was no one there. Perplexed, Lieutenant Nick led the soldiers to a house where they had seen flickering lights the night before. The door was locked, so Lieutenant Nick took the liberty of shooting the lock with his gun, wondering if the noise would attract anyone. He then instructed the soldiers to explore the house. Shortly after they entered, they called out for Lieutenant Nick to join them. Inside, they discovered the source of the flickering light, faulty wiring that was sparking intermittently. At that moment, Lieutenant Nick thought to himself, "This village is supposed to have been abandoned for 40 years, so why hasn't the electricity been cut off?" After that, Lieutenant Nick and his soldiers went upstairs. They felt like they were stepping in some liquid, so they shone their flashlights on the floor to check. They discovered they were standing in a large pool of blood, with a trail of blood leading away. Following the blood trail, they reached a bathroom door. When they opened it, they found a corpse lying inside. The body appeared to have been dead for a long time, yet it emitted no odor. The military doctor examined the body and estimated that it had been dead for about a month. After instructing the soldiers to note down the house number and other necessary information, Lieutenant Nick and his team moved on to the next house. They heard what sounded like footsteps inside. Lieutenant Nick called out, announcing their presence and instructing anyone inside to come out because the authorities were about to enter. There was no response, so he ordered the soldiers to break down the door. Inside, the house was old and cobwebbed, with a strong, musty odor. When they explored the second floor, they found no signs of anyone. However, one thing puzzled Lieutenant Nick. Despite this being a Muslim household, there were statues of Ganesha and Kumanthong, as well as offerings typical of Buddhist rituals. This odd mixture of religious artifacts left him feeling uneasy. After all the soldiers exited the house, they proceeded to explore the mosque. This time, they remembered to remove their shoes before entering, recalling the previous incident when someone had scolded them for not doing so. When Lieutenant Nick pushed open the door of the mosque, they found that its interior looked nothing like it did before. It was now old, dilapidated, and messy, in stark contrast to the clean and orderly state they had seen on their previous visit. As the soldiers used their flashlights to inspect the area, an old man suddenly emerged from the darkness and approached them, causing them to step back and shout for him to stop. They asked who he was. The old man replied that he had been watching over the place for a long time and questioned their purpose there. The driver immediately recognized him and said, "I remember you. You were the one who told us to take shelter from the rain here." Lieutenant Nick then questioned the old man. "What are you doing here? How can anyone live here? This village is abandoned and in such poor condition. Why did you tell us to come here?" At that moment, the old man spoke to them in a cold tone, saying, "I invite everyone in. Whoever passes by, I invite them all." Curious, Lieutenant Nick asked how he could live there. The old man pointed behind the mosque. When Lieutenant Nick and his team went to look, they were speechless. Behind the mosque was a graveyard. Shocked, they quickly retreated. Before they left the mosque, the old man said in a calm voice, "If you can leave, then leave." At that, the soldiers hurriedly gathered their belongings. When Lieutenant Nick tried to use his phone, he found that there was no signal at all. However, this wasn't a problem as he remembered the route clearly. They all got into their vehicle and sped away from the abandoned village. When their vehicle approached the intersection, they saw the same old man from the mosque standing in the middle of the crossroads, waiting for them. Lieutenant Nick ordered the driver to stop and got out to ask the old man what he wanted. The old man simply repeated, "If you can leave, then leave." After hearing this, Lieutenant Nick quickly got back into the vehicle and ordered the driver to drive straight ahead. They continued until they reached the main road. After driving a bit further, they descended from the mountainous area and pulled over to discuss what they had just experienced. One of the soldiers spoke up. "Sir, I noticed it from the moment we entered. I knew that this place was old and abandoned. This area is known for people being brought here to be executed. In the past, this village was a Thai Buddhist community, but it was targeted by terrorists because many military families lived there. The terrorists decided to eliminate the village completely, killing everyone and using their influence to maintain control of the area. They had someone in power act as if the village was still inhabited, without informing the authorities. The locals knew the place was abandoned, but Lieutenant Nick was unaware because he was not from the area. Lieutenant Nick decided to report this to his unit, but they dismissed his story as nonsense, believing that the village had already been thoroughly investigated. The next morning, Lieutenant Nick led his unit to inspect the abandoned village. They surveyed every house, and upon opening the doors, they found piles of human bones in almost every house. This discovery quickly made headlines, revealing the story of the village where an entire community had been massacred.